Queen Elizabeth I, Reign of Terror, 1603, Richmond Palace, United Kingdom. The British Inquisition. Queen Elizabeth, who during the reign of her sister Mary, hypocritically professed the Roman Catholic religion, on mounting the British throne, threw off the mask, and as head of the British Church, publicly professed the principles of the Reformation. To portray the true character of this queen is not very easy. Her reign was one of terror. The severest interdictions were laid on the press. It fell nearly entirely into the hands of overzealous Protestants, or cold and timid Catholics. Between the promulgation of falsehoods and suppression of truths, this might be justly styled an age of darkness and error. Under the pretext of suppressing popery, laws were passed to prevent education, a measure so opposed to the professed principles of Protestantism, that it must seem unaccountable it was not rather censored than approved by those who represented the Reformed creed as tolerating, liberal, and enlightening. It was among the charges which the press in those days made against the Catholics, that they read and gave a wrong construction to the Bible, yet the very principle of the new doctrine adopted and announced the right of private interpretation of the written Word of God, and that it contained all that was necessary to be known, yet the subjects were to be kept illiterate, whereby they must be prevented from reading the law and left open to be influenced solely by the opinion of others. Elizabeth's first proceeding, after she attained to power, was to cause all the institutions of Mary on the subject of heresy to be annulled, and others to be enacted quite as exceptionable. The main difference consisted in this: Mary persecuted Protestants, Elizabeth persecuted Catholics. The biographers of Elizabeth represent her as a model of human perfection, and her reign one most glorious for England. It was not altogether so. She lived unmarried, and would not listen to counsel on this head, but her shameless amours with several of the nobility and gentlemen of her court, the most remarkable of any in Europe for the dissoluteness of its practices, became so notorious that even her flatterers could not but condemn them, and some of those who revelled in its wantonness even boasted of their excesses. To such a degree did the beastly gallantry of Elizabeth's court arrive. In fact, the Queen set the example, her paramours and their minions followed it up. The remainder of her real character too well corresponded with that just mentioned. She was proud, haughty, and overbearing, fond of flattery, dress, and costly attendance on her person. Vain, she was an egotist, fond of displaying her accomplishments. She sought from her subjects a semi-adoration. Envious, she could not bear a rival. The beauty of Mary Queen of Scots was intolerable and led in a great degree to the protracted sufferings and finally to the execution of that princess. Elizabeth was irritable, impatient, and passionate. She cursed, she swore, and even spit upon those about her. Full of her own importance and what she believed due to her exalted station, she required the most passive obedience from her subjects. Those persons immediately engaged about her person seldom failed, when they approached her, to signify their sense of her rank by some act of servile obeisance. It was even said that many persons of the lower rank, actuated by hope or fear, paid her an unbecoming veneration in the open street. The sovereign's prerogative was, in her mind, so indisputable and inherent that she was resolved not only to maintain it, but also, if possible, to exercise it without limit. And it was the understood duty of her friend in Parliament so to maintain it. The servile Parliament gratified her almost to her utmost desire. She possessed, said an intelligent foreigner, by her prerogative whatever was requisite for the government of the realm. She could, at her pleasure, suspend the operation of existing statutes, or issue proclamation, which should have the force of law. In her opinion, the chief use of parliaments was to vote money, to regulate the minutiae of trade, and to legislate for individual and local interest. It was asserted, says another writer, that the Queen inherited both an enlarging and restraining power. By her prerogative she might set at liberty what was restrained by the statute or otherwise, and by her prerogative she might restrain what was otherwise at liberty, that the royal prerogative was not to be canvassed, nor disputed, nor examined, and not even admit of any limitation. That absolute princes such as the sovereigns of England were a species of divinity. That it was in vain to attempt tying the Queen's hands by laws or statutes, since by means of her dispensing power, she could loosen herself at pleasure, and that even if a clause should be annexed to a statute excluding her dispensing power, she could first dispense with the clause, and then with the statute. If powers like these vested in such a woman as Elizabeth produced those golden days to England pictured to us by partial writers, if such power in such hands did not produce tyranny in the monarch, and immorality in the people, then it may be said that unlimited authority in the crown is not dangerous to the governed, although it were placed in the hands of a ruffian. The reign of Elizabeth produced no argument in support of such a position. However the days might have been golden to her favorites, they were to the nation, and particularly to her Catholic subjects, inquisitorial, tyrannic, and bloody. A system of espionage, false informations, accredited spies, rewarded apostasy, led the way to arbitrary and unjust imprisonments, to confiscations, torture and death. The judges and magistrates were bribed, and justice laid prostrate at the foot of the throne. A foreigner, who had been ambassador in England, informs us that under Elizabeth the administration of justice was more corrupt than under her predecessors. We have not the means of instituting the comparison, but we know that in her first year the policy of Cecil substituted men of inferior rank in the place of former magistrates. That numerous complaints were heard of their tyranny, peculation and rapacity, and that a justice of peace was defined in Parliament to be an animal, who, for half a dozen chickens would dispense with a dozen laws, nor shall we form a very exalted notion of the integrity of the higher courts, if we recollect that judges were removable at the royal pleasure, and that the Queen herself was in the habit of receiving, and permitting her favourites and ladies to receive, bribes as the prices of her other interference in the suits of private individuals. Besides the judicial tribunals, which remain to the present day, there were in the age of Elizabeth several other courts, the arbitrary constitution of which were incompatible with the liberties of the subject. The Court of High Commission, for the cognizance of religious offences. The Court of Star Chamber, which inflicted the severest punishments for that comprehensive and undefinable transgression, contempt of the royal authority. And the Courts Martial, for which the Queen, from her hasty and imperious temper, manifested a strong predilection. Whatever could be supposed to have the remotest tendency to sedition, was held to subject the offender to martial law. The murder of a naval or military officer, the importation of disloyal or traitorous books, or the resort to one place of several persons who possessed not the visible means of subsistence. Thus in 1595, under the pretence that the vagabonds of London were not to be restrained by the usual punishments, she ordered Sir Thomas Wilford to receive from the magistrates the most notorious offenders, and to execute them upon the gallows according to the justice of martial law. Another and intolerable grievance was the discretionary power assumed by the Queen, of gratifying her caprice or resentment by the restraint or imprisonment of those who had given her offence. Such persons were ordered daily to present themselves before the council till they should receive further notice, or to confine themselves within their own doors, or were given in custody to some other person, or were thrown into a public prison. In this state they remained, according to the royal pleasure, for weeks, or months, or years, till they could obtain their liberty by their submission, or through the intercession of their friends, or with the payment of a valuable composition. The Queen was not sparing of the blood of her subjects. The statutes inflicting death for religious opinions have been already noticed. In addition, many new felonies and new treasons were created during her reign, and the ingenuity of the judges gave to these enactments the most extensive application. In 1595, some apprentices in London conspired to release their companions, who had been condemned by the Star Chamber, to suffer punishment for a riot. In 1597 a number of peasants in Oxfordshire assembled to break down enclosures and restore tillage. Each of these offences, as it opposed the execution of the law, was pronounced treason by the judges. And both the apprentices in London, and the men of Oxfordshire, suffered the barbarous death of traitors. It is not my design to enter into a comprehensive detail of the cruelties committed during the reign of Elizabeth, but my object must fail if I pass them over, in mass, by mere assertion, without authority or particulars. I already noticed the sufferings of the Puritans. I must hear it, that the persecution of the Catholics was exceedingly severe, and highly impolitic, betraying in the wise and virtuous Elizabeth, the double appendage of a bad head and a bad heart. It does not appear that the Catholics had any intention to disturb the Queen in her regal authority, nor did they dispute her right to be head of her church, with which they had no concern. The deposing power, sometimes assumed by the popes, could have no positive influence on British Catholics, because it is not an article of Catholic faith. And many are the instances of Catholics rejecting the council of popes, when not corresponding with their proper power. The Pope did attempt, during this reign, to tamper with the English Catholics, but he failed in shaking Catholic loyalty. They effectually resisted his authority in this instance. They however continued steady to the orthodoxy of their own faith, equally unmoved by the overstretched authority of the head of the Catholic, as by the severe persecution of the head of the Protestant Church. This fact should be sufficient to remove any apprehension, if such existed in the mind of the Queen, that Catholic loyalty to a Protestant government was inconsistent with the closest adherence to the tenets of the Catholic creed. But persecution entered into the system of this Queen's government, and religion was resorted to as a pretext. The fidelity of the Catholic subjects could not be brought fairly in question, and, considering the provocations to violate it, they may be said to have remained obstinately loyal. Writers were employed to defame them, ministers of the gospel invite against them from the pulpit, letters were written, and intercepted, perhaps by the writers, to prove meditated plots against the state. They were charged with a design to set the Queen of Scots at liberty, and with the intention of aiding every foreign Catholic prince or power hostile to England, or of whose inimical views any fear was entertained. Persecution towards the Catholics seemed to be administered as a preventive of guilt, and truly severe was the punishment which suspicion inflicted. Dr. Milner, in alluding to the state of the Catholics during the reign of Elizabeth, says the conduct of the great body of the Catholics at that period was unrivaled for its fidelity. They saw a princess mount the throne, whose title was invalid by their church law, and whose hostile conduct in their regard they anticipated and idea, without offering the smallest resistance to it. They were then the majority of the nation. Almost all the ancient nobility were of their communion, and the ministry, as it was left by Mary, were all zealous Catholics. Nothing then would have been so easy for them as to have excluded Elizabeth from the succession, if they had copied the example which the Protestants set them at the death of Edward VI. Nevertheless they concurred with firm hands, though with sorrowful hearts, in raising her to the throne, because it was her lawful right. They saw her begin her reign with violating her coronation oath, by changing the religion of the kingdom, which had been established in it almost 1,000 years before, and which she had sworn to defend, and even with enacting the penalty of death against the profession of it. They experienced pecuniary mulets and corporal punishments, which were multiplied and aggravated, year after year, without number or measure, in order to extirpate them from the land of their nativity. They found themselves, at every turn, accused and punished for pretended conspiracies, and what was the most cruel circumstance of all, they perceived innumerable snares and the most scandalous arts of seduction and forgery employed by ministry, to draw as many as possible of their number into real ones. In the meantime they were told by the head of their church that they were no longer obliged to obey. And they beheld the most powerful prince in Europe sending an armament, which passed for invincible, to invade the realm, the success of which would at once have placed them above the heads of their persecutors. Yet, in spite of all this, they continued, priests and laity, when at liberty and when in prison, in their hiding places and under the gallows, to acknowledge the title of their unnatural sovereign, to pray for her prosperity, and to condemn all enterprises to secure their lives and the free exercise of their religion, at the expense of the public peace and of the lawful government. The Queen was said to have shown early proof of her discretion and acuteness in the selection of her ministers. In truth, they were the most profligate she could have chosen. The Earl of Leicester, one of the handsomest men in England, owed to his personal beauty that he became a favourite and minister of the Queen. The intercourse between him and the Virgin Sovereign was so familiar as to produce rumour very unfavourable to the Queen's honour. It was also supposed that a marriage might take place which would elevate the Earl to a throne, the Countess having died suddenly, as was then well known, by means of his violent abuse of her. The Queen, it appears, was too fond of her liberty. His marriage with the Dowager Countess of Essex lost him the affections of the Queen. He however continued in the ministry. Leicester was a man of great ambition, extravagant in his personal expenses, indifferent to the means, however censurable, by which they might be supplied. He was insincere, unprincipled, cruel, and treacherous. If he had religion, it was that of Puritanism, but even in this he was more of a hypocrite than a zealot. Sir William Cecil, Principal Secretary of State, served in various offices during the successive reigns of Henry, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. He was a religious man, but so complying in his manners, that he concurred, in this respect, with the reigning monarch. Whether 6 or 60 articles were the fashion, Cecil was prompt to adopt the prevailing creed. He was patronized and raised to fortune by the Earl of Somerset, the regent of the kingdom during the minority of Edward VI. On the decline of the fortunes of this nobleman, the ungrateful Cecil joined the opposing party, and was chiefly instrumental in bringing his patron to the block. In his public conduct at home, he was cruel and unrelenting. In his official intercourse with foreign powers, he was unsteady and unprincipled. He was as wasteful of the blood of the subject, as he was faithless to all public engagements. Such were the characters who acted as the counsellors of the Queen. From such what could be expected, but what did happen? The first primate after the Queen's accession was Parker, a man rigid in exacting conformity to the established worship, and in punishing, by fine and deprivation, all the puritanical clergymen who attempted to innovate anything in the habit, ceremonies, or liturgy of the Church. He died 1575, and was succeeded by Grendel, who, as he himself was inclined to the new sect, was with great difficulty brought to execute the laws against them, or to punish the nonconforming clergy. He declined obeying the Queen's orders for the suppression of prophesyings, or the assemblies of the zealots in private houses, which she apprehended had become so many academies of fanaticism. And for this offence she had, by an order of the Star Chamber, sequestered him from archiepiscopal function, and confined him to his own house. Upon his death, which happened in 1583, she determined not to fall into the same error in her next choice, and she named Whitgift, a zealous churchman, who had already signalized his pen in controversy, and who, having in vain attempted to convince the Puritans by argument, was now resolved to open their eyes by power, and by the execution of penal statutes. He informed the Queen that all the spiritual authority lodged in the prelates was insignificant without the sanction of the Crown. And as there was no ecclesiastical commission at that time in force, he engaged her to issue a new one, more arbitrary than any of the former, and conveying more unlimited authority. She appointed 44 commissioners, 12 of whom were ecclesiastics. 3 commissioners made a quorum. The jurisdiction of the court extended over the whole kingdom, and over all orders of men. And every circumstance of its authority, and all its methods of proceeding, were contrary to the clearest principles of law and natural equity. The commissioners were empowered to visit and reform all errors, heresies, schisms, in a word, to regulate all opinions, as well as to punish all breach of uniformity in the exercise of public worship. They were directed to make inquiry, not only by the legal methods of juries and witnesses, but by all other ways and means which they could devise, that is, by the rack, by torture, by inquisition, by imprisonment. Where they found reason to suspect any person, they might administer to him an oath, called ex officio, by which he was bound to answer all questions, and might thereby be obliged to accuse himself, or his most intimate friend. The fines which they levied were discretionary, and often occasioned the total ruin of the offender. The imprisonment, to which they condemned any delinquent, was limited by no rule but their own pleasure. They assumed a power of imposing on the clergy what new articles of subscription, and consequently of faith, as they thought proper. Though all other spiritual courts were subject, since the Reformation, to inhibitions from the supreme courts of law, the ecclesiastical commissions were exempted from that legal jurisdiction, and were liable to no control. And the more to enlarge their authority, they were empowered to punish all incest, adulteries, fornications, all outrages, misbehaviors, and disorders in marriage, and the punishments which they might inflict, were according to their wisdom, conscience and discretion. In a word, this court was a real inquisition, attended with all the iniquities, as well as cruelties of that tribunal. The penal laws enacted by the parliaments of Elizabeth would disgrace a Nero, even although one of them had never been put in execution. But, when it is known that they were all put in execution, what can be said of this persecuting reign but that it was a bad one? A digest of the laws against popery published in 1791, by the late Simon Butler, an Irish lawyer, presented to the reader a specimen of the most infamous legislation. It is now impossible to give the number, character, or rank of the sufferers under the laws of Elizabeth. In one account, now before me, it is stated that upwards of 200 persons were put to death for professing the Catholic faith, during the last 20 years of the golden days. Of these, 142 were priests. 90 priests or Catholic laypersons died in prison, 105 others were sent into exile. Of those who were whipped, fined, or stripped of their entire property, no account pretends to state the number. 100 Catholic gentlemen were confined at one time in the prisons of Lancaster and Yorkshire for the crime of not attending service in the Protestant Church. Many or most of these fell victims to the length and severity of their sufferings. A writer gives an account of 1,200 Catholics who suffered in some shape on account of their religion, before the year 1588. The Reverend Sturges, Protestant Prebendary of Winchester, England, and Dr. Milner, Catholic Bishop of London, have written largely on the subject of British persecution. The latter proposes balancing the accounts, with a view of determining on which side the greatest sum of sufferings appears. To my present purpose, it matters not a fig how the account stands. Catholics have persecuted Protestants, and Protestants have persecuted Catholics. Both had their bloody inquisitions. Are both ready to allow that their respective religions had nothing to do in it? I trust they are so. The denial of this would infer that both religions are sanguinary and cruel. If so, it is time we get rid of both. Queen Mary burned the Protestants, and the Catholic prelates Gardiner and Bonner stand charged with advising or concurring in the measures. Elizabeth did not use fire in the execution of Catholics, that is, did not apply it as Mary did, but she caused or permitted the sentence awarded to high treason to be literally executed on them. They were hung by the neck but not until dead. They were taken down while yet alive. Their bowels were ripped out and burned before their face, their heads severed from their bodies, their bodies cut into quarters, and the heads and bodies disposed of as Her Majesty pleased to direct. Torture was applied in this and other reigns to Catholic priests and laymen. The priest Campion underwent it several times, until nearly all his bones were dislocated, insomuch that he was unable to raise either hand, and having refused to conform to the established religion, was publicly executed. The Protestant prelates, Home, Cooper, Neale, and Elmer have respectively been zealous persecutors, and the latter frequently attended to the infliction of torture on the prisoners in the Tower. Cranmer had been also instrumental in sending several persons to the stake, some of them for denying the real presence in the sacrament, the very act of which he was himself, subsequently, if not previously, guilty. He signed the death warrant of Lord Thomas Seymour. During the infant reign of Edward, this was an act of which he might excuse himself, on account of his priestly functions, and which was a violation of them. Cranmer, in this instance, exceeded any act committed by the Inquisition in Catholic countries. Whatever may have been the private wish, design, or feeling, of the Catholic ecclesiastics who acted as inquisitors, they had always too much respect for their own character to avow their having any participation in the sentences or execution of those who come under their cognizance. In fact, no power existed in the Inquisition to order any person to death, that was reserved, in form, if not in fact, for the civil authority. Among the many persons tortured at this time, was George Throgmorton. His papers were seized, and 2 letters of a treasonable nature were found among them. He denied any knowledge of them. He was tortured until, maddened by pain, he acknowledged the truth of whatever charge his tormentors choose to bring against him, and, among others, his having written these treasonable letters. He died, protesting he had no knowledge of these papers, and that he believed they were placed in his portfolio, after it was taken from him. The Earl of Leicester was known to have made out a list of persons who were to be prosecuted for heresy or treason. His sudden death, supposed by poison, saved the lives of the intended victims. This monster, minister and counsellor of the Queen, had but just got through the bloody work of dispatching a large number of Catholics, when he prepared this new list. Sir Francis Walsingham, another in the worst of Elizabeth's ministers, was so violent in his hatred of Catholics, that he seldom failed when any of them were brought before him, to insult them with the grossest language, and with accusations, which he knew were false. He has even been known to commit unprovoked and illegal assaults on them. This man was the chief manager of those letters and papers, which were, from time to time, made the presumed justification of the persecution, and finally destruction of the unfortunate Mary Queen of Scots. Queen Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603 at Richmond Palace, between 2 and 3 in the morning. James I would become King of England. He was born of Catholic parents. James resigned his Catholic subjects to their enemies. Amen.